Hi everyone, this is Namit. I'm 19 and I'm a part of the 2021 batch of the FAIR project, and I'm currently pursuing economics from the University of Delhi. Today I'll be talking about the informal economy, gender inequality and social protection. So to begin with, I'd like to start by defining what the informal sector of the economy would mean. The informal sector includes irregular, unorganized employment, which is not liable to receive social protection and social security from their employers, and it's largely that sector of the economy which does not come under government regulations. To give some examples, it would be the street vendors, it would be the people who put out carts and put out their stuff on carts and sell them roaming around the streets. It would be the small Karyana stores at the corner of your street. It would be the domestic workers, it would be the care workers, it would be the rag pickers, and things like that. All of this constitutes the system of the informal economy. And while this may seem like a huge number, but around 80 to 90% of India's total workforce, which could be around, I think, 400 to 500 million people, they're engaged in the informal sector of the economy, and around 55% of India's GDP comes from this sector as well. Around 2 billion people in the world are engaged in this sector, and as Robert Neuwirth put it, if you were to take up everyone who works in the informal sector, put them to a country, then that country would have a GDP of over $10.5 trillion. So again, when you think of it like that, you tend to think that this is quite an attractive economic system, but it's really not. There exists a plethora of issues and problems when it comes to the informal sector of the economy, and they're largely because of the fact that people who work in the informal sector are vulnerable to exploitation from their employers. That's because of a lack of social protection and the lack of social securities that they face. A lot of people in the informal sector are pushed into poverty or come from poverty because when you're poor, you don't really have access to resources to give you enough abilities and skills to give you a formal employment. And one part of the formal and informal economy debate is that we take the definition of informal sector as the absence of formality, which I do not agree with, because I think of both of these sectors as two ends of the same continuum, because people keep flowing in and out of the informal sector as times and situations change, and they go from formal to informal or informal to formal. Things like these keep happening, so you can't really put and define these two as separate entities. One part of the informal sector which I think needs a lot of work is the gender inequality and the gender inequities that persist in the informal sector, largely due to patriarchy, the imbalance that the patriarchy has created, and the gender biases that exist in the society. A lot of times, families who come from not so privileged backgrounds and not so well off families who tend to end up working in the informal sector have this bias of preferring their male children over their female children, and thus female children are not provided with enough education, nutrition, or abilities or opportunities to develop skill sets to give them a formal employment. So in a way, one can say that a lot of times women who end up working in the informal sector work out of compulsion and not choice. It's because of the limited opportunities, it's because that it's difficult for them to get a formal employment, it's because of the discrimination that they've faced, and it's because of a lot of other factors that come into play, like security and lack of poverty and lack of access to resources and things like that, that sort of push them to this sector. And even in this sector, they're generally paid less than men. When we look at the entire gender pay debate, the gender pay gap debate, a large part of where this sort of difference exists, other than domestic help, women are less likely to be paid equal to men, and they're paid lesser than men in the informal sector. So this inequality sort of persists, and there are situations where women tend to be more unsafe, and studies have shown that as economic insecurities grow in a family, so does violence against women, and studies have also shown that women, as they get more economically independent, they become more prone to violence. So changing these in terms of social protection and actual protection would be to start working from the grassroots level, because clearly there's a lot of work that has been done, but it's not enough, and the work that has been done has helped, but there's clearly a lot more that needs to be done. When we talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, which still hasn't ended, a lot of us were still facing the brunt of it. Lives were lost, the economies were shaken, and it has affected women and children the most. And according to the State of Working India report, the informality in the economy also saw an increase. To look at, so a little backstory to that is that when the pandemic hit and people started losing out on their jobs, 61% of men remained in the jobs that they were in, and only 7% had to face permanent job loss. But when you look at these numbers for women, they're more shocking, because for women, 47% of them faced permanent job losses, and only 19% of them were able to remain in the employment that they were in. In areas and some places, only 5 out of 10 women were able to go back to work after the lockdowns were lifted and things started getting back to normal, if you can define a normal. So, and when we talk about an increase in informality, half of the formal salaried workers have shifted to the informal sector, 30% as self-employed, 10% as casual workers, and 9% as the informal salaried. So when we look at this sort of numbers, you'd think that, with an influx of people in the informal sector, there would have been measures taken to help these out. That's true, it happened. The government launched the PMGKY, the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, which was essentially a culmination of a lot of pre-existing schemes. There was this one nation, one ration card thing to help increase the efficiency of the public distribution system, and a lot of other schemes that happened, like the MSME packages and stuff. But the main problem with those were of accessibility. I think a large part of problems that persist in the informal sector is not availability, but rather accessibility, because a lot of people tend to just slip through the cracks. So in these situations, people who were in most need of the resources were not able to get them because of a lack of accessibility. Some of them did not have Jan Dhan accounts. Some people did not have bank accounts because they don't necessarily earn enough to put in a bank. People face such problems at a very large scale, and one important aspect of this would be that things are changing, times are changing, and urbanization is on the rise. Yet in India, 70% of poverty eradication and sort of social protection acts, all of them focus on rural areas at large. So it's important to change that. The PM Swanidhi Act, which was made specifically for street vendors, did help, but again, because a lot of people do not have access to resources to gain access to the benefits of these schemes, it sort of did not play that well. And there have been talks of combining 44 labor laws into 4 codes, namely of the Code on Wages, Code on Industrial Relations, on Social Security, Safety and Health, and the one on working conditions. So it's important for the government to do these, because the Unorganized Social Security Act, passed in 2008, as Sanjay Ghosh said, wasn't implemented properly. People were still not able to reap the total benefits that were meant for them to be sort of, and essentially 80% of households did get access to the resources by the Jan Dhan Yojana and stuff. But a part of the problem is people falling through the cracks and the leakages that exist in the system. So I think to solve this issue of social protection or the lack thereof, and gender inequality or the gender equality or the lack thereof in the informal sector, has to come through a multi-layered model, a multi-layered hybrid model where people have access to resources both offline and online, because there is a digital divide in this country. A lot of people don't have access to technology simply because they can't afford it. So there is that. And another part that I think could work would be direct benefit transfer schemes, because they've seemed to work in the past and they sort of eliminate the number of steps that are included and the middlemen that are included that can sort of not like let these people get the resources that they need to get. And it is really essential because a lot of times in the informal sector, people do not have an employer-employee, a letter of employment or an employer-employee relationship, which do not let them to get the benefits that are made for them. So what is it that can be done? An increase in employment, increase in self-help groups like the Seva for women, and economic inclusion, I think, is an important part. With the rights-based approach, solutions need to be sector-specific and people-specific because of the intersectionality that exists. And in terms of grants and economic support, direct benefit transfer schemes, and a much larger focus on the supply side, because people will be able to get benefits of these schemes only when they're accessible to them. Thank you.